The next lecture is going to be given by Professor Bengt Holmström, and here are his stats. He was born in Helsinki. He got his PhD from Stanford, and he's now a professor of economics and management at MIT. And I would like to invite Professor Holmström to come up here and give his lecture.
Thank you, Thomas. I want to thank the Academy, the Royal Academy, for bestowing us with this great honor. And thank you all for coming. There are a lot of friends here. It's very difficult to see from here where they are, but it's much appreciated. And I must say that I'm delighted to share this prize with my somewhat senile friend, Oliver, who is very close to me. I want to try to say something about my work, obviously, but I also want to try to convey in this lecture a little bit how we think, or I at least think about theory. I'm a theorist. And you know, economics may sometimes seem like it's either incomprehensibly stupid or trivial, but nothing in between. And I'm going to try to explain some of the thinking that may seem obvious, but actually requires some further thought. And so that's was telling something about my journey is basically the plan, a narrative of how I got into incentives and what were key steps in one of the strands of what I've done, especially motivating workers. So in some sense it complements Oliver's talk in that I'm focused more on contracts, broadly construed, and I'm also focused on contracts within the firm rather than between firms. I want to say a word about how I got into it because it's unusual, slightly unusual. I didn't plan to be an economist, and I didn't start off on that track. I went off, I was a mathematician, an applied mathematician. I went to work for a firm in Finland that's called Alstom. It was one of the top 10 firms and a progressive firm. It's a big conglomerate. It had 30 factories or so. And I was hired as for a very specific task, which was to implement a big corporate planning model. Corporate planning models of that sort don't exist anymore, and I hope for some of the reasons I will explain. But that was the rage at the time. Any progressive firm would want to have a big planning model. We are talking about a linear programming model, for those who know what that means. Thousands of equations, thousands of activities, 5-year out, plans about investment, plans about production, all how they depend and integrate, you know, describing sort of the inner workings of the firm. It was terrific in the sense that it was a wonderful way for somebody like me who was a mathematician to actually come to learn about how a big company works. I got to work with the CFO, not with the CEO, a very charismatic CFO who was a very tough guy, but somehow took a liking to me because he liked that I said what I thought. And he would then say pretty often when I thought wrongly. But we got along very well. And so I started on this work by collecting information from these factories. I went out to the factories and talked to them, and it didn't take very long to realize that this seemed like a pretty meaningless task, in the sense that, you know, what these guys were in the factories worried about was, first of all, that, you know, some new gadget comes and, you know, somehow screws up their life. But secondly, they were gaming it, you know, they were sort of asking indirectly, almost directly questions, you know, what should I put in to get maximally things out for myself? And I don't think they were doing it to cheat people, but they had the view that headquarters didn't know what they were doing. And so, they had to somehow adjust, not send the numbers that were true, but send some other numbers so that would kind of correct what the headquarters thought about. So I could see that there were, the two sides of the problem was neither side somehow had the full information, and this was a complicated problem, completely swamping the problem of actually calculating this gigantic model, which itself was, of course, complicated. So I suggested that let's scan it. And subsequently, I heard they thought for a moment to fire me, but the CFO saved me and said, let's put him to work on something else. And the something else was very small models, incentive models, and various versions of how do we incentivize these people in the right way. Looking at it now, pretty pathetic, but I tried my best. Models about incentives, and so on. And then I got the lucky draw, which was I was awarded a scholarship to go to Stanford for a sabbatical from this firm. And the lucky draw really wasn't just Stanford. It was that I realized incentives was actually also an interest of economists at the time. And I got to go to Bob Wilson's class, which was an iconic class at the business school. Bob Wilson subsequently became an advisor. I'm very glad that he's here with us here today. And I asked him about the incentives, and he pointed me to work that was worth reading. First, I thought it was gibberish, but eventually I started to realize it was actually made kind of sense. I don't know if you will think that way. So that's how I ended up where I am right now. And I feel pretty pleased about it. So I write paper for performance and beyond because I have a very simple narrative in the sense that, I went there like most people. I thought that paper performance is the thing, the sort of medicine for incentive problems. And after 30 or so years of studying it, I'm more or less thinking pay for performance, to simplify, is the problem. And if this sounds like the Republicans, maybe it is. But I'm going to start with a simple paper performance story, the way we studied it in the early days. And by the way, Wilson wrote a very early paper on it in '69, and Steve Ross, another friend, in '73, and so on. So there was a literature that I began with, and I will start from that literature and then show you how I developed it together with co-authors, how I developed it further into the view that I was just suggesting, that this problem is much more than about pay for performance. So I call it the principal agent problem. That's the language we use. I'm not going to use any equations and such. I had such slides, but I decided to take it away because I'm trying to explain it. It's a canonic model, a sort of simplified model of a complicated situation where there's just one principal, a boss, say, an employee is the agent, the employer is the boss. It could be a client who is the boss in the case of hiring a lawyer who is the agent. It could be the board, which is the boss, and the CEO, who is the agent, and so on. It's a model that kind of just studies the question of what kind of incentive pay would be suitable in a very generic context. And there are two difficulties that makes the model is the interest of the model. And that is preferences are not aligned and performance are imperfectly measured. And these two things make the problem a complication. And I come to that just in a second. But then, secondly, there's the incentive is, as I said, just a contract where based on measured performance, which, as I said just a moment ago, was imperfect. So that's the setup. And it's good we usually start with saying what is the first best, meaning if we didn't have these problems, what would be the solution? And actually, Thomas already mentioned it, but the first best cases are two. Actually, there are three, but I want to just mention two. Agent's choice is verifiable, so we can actually observe what you are doing, what the employee is doing. In that case, the contract is just written so that it says, do this, or then you don't get any pay, or you get a punishment, or something like that. So and then because the agent typically is risk averse, and that's, did I mention the risk aversion, or? Yeah, it's a preference are not aligned. I should have mentioned it's because the agent is risk averse and the principal is risk neutral. So the agent doesn't like to carry risk. So the ideal is to pay the agent a fixed wage if the agent didn't have any action that would have to be incentivized. The other case is where the agent is risk neutral, in which case doesn't worry about the risk and therefore could carry the whole risk for himself. This is the case we call a rental agreement, or the agent is a residual claimant. Just to give you a sense, taxi cabs drivers typically are on this scheme. It's very difficult to measure their performance, so they actually are residual claimants. They rent the car from somebody who owns the car and then get the most, if not all of the income from driving. This gives the right incentives. They are like, their own owner when they are driving. But in the general case, the second best is in this model one about balancing incentives against risk. And rather than saying how this is studied and so on, let me say my contribution to this part was to try to understand how this model was thinking. This is a very big part of the way I look at this theory. It's an experiment. It's crucial to try to understand how the model thinks. And then if we can't do that, then that's not a model that I typically like to work on. So, and I emphasize the fact that sometimes you think you understand it, but you actually don't. So this informativeness principle may sound very simple. So it says that I asked the question, or actually it was asked before, the question of, instead of asking what should the incentive schemes look like, a preceding question is, what information is valuable for incentive contracting? And the answer sounds kind of silly or trivial. Anything that is informative about the agent's choice of action should go into it. And this is something that Steve Chauvel and I jointly discovered, and both papers were published together in the same volume. But what is not so trivial about this is that a lot of people actually thought at the time this is not the case. So the going view was that if some signal is noisy enough about what you are doing, then it's worthless. So this is, in that sense, a surprising answer. It is not the reason. Another way of looking at it is to look at an old accounting principle. So if you read accounting books in the Times, they would say pay should only depend on variables that the agent can control. Sounds like a very sensible principle too. But if you look at the relative performance, to take one of the applications of the informativeness principle, you will see that relative performance means that if you do something and I'm paying you for it, I may want to see somebody else who's doing something similar to you and seeing how well is that person doing, and then based on that decide whether to pay you a lot or little or adjust the payment by sort of the circumstances. And the point is that because the agent is not the sole producer of the performance measure, there's luck, either bad luck or good luck, that also affects the performance measure. Then filtering out something about that noise that shouldn't be there to get a better and more perfect performance measure, that's where the relative performance is very, very valuable. So actually, taking something the agent cannot control helps me take out something that the agent can't control in the original measure. That's the logic of why it is actually good, and thereby reducing the risk. And so the controllability principle got to be adjusted. Accountants changed the way they define controllability. The measure becomes more controllable thanks to relative performance evaluation. I think the informativeness principle wouldn't be talked about as much, or I'm not thinking so much about it I should say, by the way, that it has been used now as this aspect of my work has been heavily used for telling that CEOs should be paid for, not for luck, bad or good, but typically for good luck. So people, various corporate governance advocates are very big on this idea that their pay should be adjusted as a function of macroeconomic circumstances and so on. Doesn't seem to happen quite that way. And I don't want to get into that. For me, the informativeness, or for this narrative, the informativeness, the importance of it is that it tells exactly actually how the model thinks. So the fact that you get this principle holds it's saying that all the minute pieces of information about the agents, whether the agent did what sort of was expected of the agent, is relevant for evaluating the agent. What it explains several puzzles, and I come to one just shortly, but basically explains why the model tends to produce extremely complicated answers. You don't get a linear scheme, you don't get necessarily say, single bonus scheme or anything that you see in reality, or option or whatnot. That's the con part of this principle. It just basically says nothing about the shape, except for very rare circumstances. So it is oversensitive to the information. But it also, by being oversensitive, it does explain, we understand exactly how this thinks. And one place where it is especially important is in an example, a striking example that Merlis brought up in a paper in 1976, where he basically said that if you look at the simplest of examples, mathematical examples, where the agent puts in an effort and then you add a noise term, and the noise term is what we call normally distributed, meaning it's the very familiar bell-shaped distribution function that we all know about. This seems like the obvious example to look at. And this does not give a sensible sounding answer. The optimal incentive actually doesn't, first of all, exist, but you can approximate arbitrarily closely the first best by increasingly punishing the agent for increasingly bad outcomes. So somewhere far out in the tail, when you were supposed to perform at 100 and you get minus 10,000, then we really punish you hard. And that will keep you working just the way I want it. And for the most part, you are just paid a flat wage. Now, Paul Milgram and I looked at this example and drew, by the way, this, I should say, informativeness exactly explains why this is the case. Because the model, the tail of the normal distribution is hugely informative. And so this model you're paying the person exactly as a function of how much information there is in the outcome signal with regard to whether the agent did what was expected or not. So Paul Milgram and I looked at this example, and we I had been working for a while here. I wasn't happy with this model, the basic model. I was doing well in the labor market, but I wasn't feeling well because this work didn't seem to be right. I understood the model was correct, but it wasn't giving what we wanted. So I invited Paul to work with me, and this was, you talked about 10 days. I think we spent about a week or so, and we figured out. It was a simpler problem, Oliver, don't worry. I think actually we spent 3 hours, but I didn't want to. Very simple answer. the linear incentive is optimal in our model, just to cut it short, is because it puts the same incentive pressure. It's not sensitive, linear schemes are not sensitive to the fine details of information. And another way of putting it is the Merle is extreme, it's a very extreme scheme to pay, you know, when you, in the very tail of a distribution. If you just change the situation a little bit, or you make another little, you know, your view of measurement error was not exactly correct, then it all falls apart. So the linear scheme was robust in a sense. And this, I would say that this has led to its own literature, and it sort of shifted the literature towards a view where we're actually looking at a model where the agent, just one little thing, such as the level of effort, is actually not the simplest case to study. It's about the most complicated thing to study, because the behavior of the model is so erratic, despite the seeming simplicity. And I think this is a very important thing, because a lot of people walked around and looked at Merle's case and said, you know, well, that's ridiculous, let's just study linear incentives, because it's simpler. This is not relevant for us. So this is I mean, you don't do theory in order to just dismiss a model that says you should really punish people at the very tail of the distribution, which is anything but linear, and then you say, okay, thank you for the advice, and then I just go and assume something. So this is, to me, a very deep lesson with regard to doing theory. We do theory to listen to what the model says, and then we go and find out why it's saying it. And in this case, it led to the insight that we were looking at the wrong kinds of models. So the models with one task, in this case, by the way, the dynamic model is one with a lot of actions, where the agent, the basic intuition is that the agent has a lot more control over his performance if he chooses things dynamically over time against the bonus or against the Merle scheme. But I don't want to speak about the linear model, except to say that the thing that caught the eye of Paul and me was the fact that, first of all, the linear model worked logically. You know, you ask it a question, so, you know, what about if there's less risk? Well, then you can pay the agent a steeper incentive because the agent is risk averse. What if the agent is less risk averse? Then you also pay a steeper incentive, that is a higher commission. What if the value of the agent's effort is higher? All these are right answers. Let me just explain. If you had asked these questions for the first model I was talking about, you would get no answer, or you could get completely crazy answers. So the thing that is, however, hidden in this answer, and that shows that when you look at this model in detail, is that there was a little detail in the story that we had ignored sort of for 10 years at least in this, which is that it also depended how much bang for the buck you get if you raise the incentive. And this comes from the agent's cost function. And it became important because it meant that actually you have another instrument than paying the agent. You can also perhaps change the cost function of the agent. So we got into the idea of multitasking, the idea of multiple instruments. And so let me give just a short review of the multitasking, or some examples. When you have many tasks, I think the game sort of for us changed completely. It was not about level effort, it's about do people allocate their effort correctly. And it's actually challenging because there are some tasks that are very easy to measure and there are some tasks that are hard to measure. And you have to sort of consider the fact that even though you can easily observe one, if you raise, say, take the quantity versus quality, where quantity usually is easy to measure, quality is hard to measure. If you raise the incentive on quantity, then that makes it harder to incentivize quality. And in fact, in the first instance, the agent will allocate away effort from quality into quantity. And we will see many examples like that. The same appears in short-term versus long-term decisions. If you push the short-term, you will have a problem with the long-term, and so on. And so let me jump to the scandals, which has been, which are very often functions of this multitasking problem. And there's even the saying of you get what you pay for is one of the problems. So Wells Fargo is a very recent case in the US. You know, the Wells Fargo workers were found to have manufactured, I think, over 1 million fake accounts. I mean, they had names like Holmström and Hart, but we didn't know that there were such accounts. And they were used, there was no money in it, but because they were paid for creating accounts and various products and selling them, then they got bonuses, and the life was happy for a couple of years, but no longer. And now I think about 5,000 people have been fired. And the CEO, of course, had to step out. So that's an example of where you start pushing people. It's not that they are evil, by the way. Some may be, but you know, I don't believe that. That's not my experience. It's just that they are, so much is expected of them, that they in a, some sort of, some people lose it. And they just feel like they have to manufacture somehow in response to what's required in order to hold on to their job. So the BP and oil Gulf spill, which is I think, in the memory of some of you, is a disastrous case of this, in that BP will highly incentivize. I mean, there are other stories of this, but I was actually working for McKinsey at the time and saw this closely. Very aggressive top-down demands that people should deliver, you know, discover oil, pump oil, you know, do what the wildcatters, the entrepreneurs were doing so well. And I think it is clear that led to shading in terms of quality. Enron is an example of misaligned incentives. So this is an old problem. It actually goes back to General Motors and Fisher Body, is that you have somebody working for you who is actually basically owning a subsidiary. You give the subsidiary to some, you incentivize these people for the subsidiary, but you don't realize that they are just going to, you know, they have total imbalance. They are 100% of the subsidiary or 1% of Enron. That's not a very natural situation or correct situation for incentives. And teachers are a big subject in the US right now, that teaching the test, which is not wrong in principle, but it just cuts into the value of having teachers actually teach students what they also need, namely social skills, verbal skills, presentation skills. All that is very hard to measure. So that leads to problems. And so what is the remedy? So the remedy here, and let's leave this, the sort of insight of multitasking is that there are two ways you can stimulate, say, presentation skills in school if you're a teacher. One, or get a teacher to allocate time for that. One is to pay more, somehow measure after all, how they present these students and, you know, have some context or have opinions about that. But the easier task typically is don't incentivize competing tasks. So it's actually a story that leads to, this multitasking story is very much connected to low-powered incentives. That is, low-powered incentives in many, many situations, no incentive. Financial, monetary, pecuniary incentives is actually the best incentive for something else. So even if something is perfectly measurable and on its own that task could be perfectly incentivized, first best as I called it, you actually don't do anything. You ignore that information, and your pay is independent of it. The idea which floats around a lot also, and people have an instinct and workers like, well, pay me for what I can control. That can be very dangerous and damaging for the same reason. Because it's easy to produce results, but it's the wrong kinds of results. So I come to the important corollary. of this multitasking is multiple instruments. You say, well, what do I do if I can't incentivize? I can't pay anything. Pay for performance is not the right rule. The answer is there are alternatives inside the firm especially. And it sort of builds on this red thing at the bottom. Employees want to be appreciated. I've spent 13 years on the Nokia board. We got every year these yearly evaluations of what workers like and don't like about Nokia. In the top 3 always, I would love to know better what my boss wants me to do. That is, there is this craving that in the firm, you try to influence people's views of you. It's you want to do good perhaps, but above all, you want to be appreciated. You want to know what will it take to be appreciated. It's a little bit like one of the emails I got about the Nobel Prize. What should I do to get a Nobel Prize, it said. There was another person who wanted to be appreciated. So the other thing is, so then the job design is a very important way. So you have these sort of weaker measures or drivers of performance. Then you can, the firm has a lot of instruments used for channeling that energy, if you wish, or the desire. And that is through job design. You can split up, for instance, dealing with this easy to measure or hard to measure. You can split up the jobs. You have 2 different kinds of teachers, those that just teach math and those that teach performance or speaking skills or whatever is hard to measure. Bureaucratic rules, which people tend to think, that's the vogue now. How do we incentivize this poorly performing government? The answer is, in general, you don't. When people come with the ideas that they should come and bring incentive base into the government, that is very, very frustrating. So there's just, here's authority, career path, supervision, recruiting. There's just tons of instruments inside the firm. So the firm can, first of all, much more powerfully tap into the desire of people to be appreciated. And that opens up all other instruments that are non-pecuniary, non-performance, pay-for-performance instruments. So I got the, let me just conclude by saying there's a lot beyond pay for performance. Multitasking problem, this measurement problem, this sort of imbalance that you get if you have many tasks, it's just not coming only for pay for performance. There's career concerns and other drivers that can lead to problems. Devatri Jewett and Tirol has a paper on it. There's a desire to be appreciated leads to influence costs that Milgram and Roberts have talked about. By the way, the asset ownership is an instrument, and we just heard Oliver talk about prisons. That's a multitasking problem, misalignment problem. And one of the things I just leave you with is the world, I think the nature of work is changing dramatically. And you have your phones. Some of you are reading your phones. You are multitasking. You are not getting the valuable wisdom in this lecture. It's a problem. And we can't. That's one of the things that I think worry me a little bit, is that you don't know what your workers are doing, but you may have to increase your punishment significantly for instance, trying to run a separate business. While you are doing something, you're actually using your mobile phone to run a couple of other businesses or whatever it is. And it turns out that punishments are getting extremely severe for this kind of activity. And that is also, it's going back to my original informatives, that is actually the right thing from the incentive point of view too, because you don't have to do that. There's no error term in that sense, and therefore the punishment should be very severe. Thank you very much. Hold on. Here I forgot entirely that here I have my whole support troops. And Bob Wilson, you see my advisor, is in the top. We haven't written anything. Everybody else is a co-author. But Paul Milgram is to the left, and Shanti Roll to the right, and Oliver got a prominent place. I do remember your name. And John Roberts, unfortunately, can't be here, but wonderful people. Gary is here, and I think that's the people who are here. Just wonderful people to work with. Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to invite Professor Hart to come up on stage. Ni kan väl gå fram dit till strålkastarljuset.